"I won't ask you to do it for nothing," Silas Merrow said, and he set the coat on the counter with both hands flat, the way you set down something that once cost more than money. The coat was charcoal wool, the kind of coat a man buys when he still believes in occasion. The lining had let go at the left seam, and the third button was missing, and the shoulders were worn to a shine that had nothing to do with polish. He was thin inside it, the way a man goes thin slowly, one missed meal reasoning with the next, until the thinness becomes the fact of him. His hands, when he drew them back from the coat, were the color of old pine, the knuckles thick from years of gripping things, the nails dark at the corners with something that wasn't dirt. Wood stain, Ailsa Breck realized, and linseed oil faint beneath everything else. "I didn't ask you to pay me," she said. "You were about to." "I was about to ask you what needed doing." She lifted the coat by the collar, felt the weight of the wool, turned it to the window where the November light came in flat and grey off the harbour. "The button's replaceable. The seam's straightforward. It wants an hour, maybe 2. "Miss," he stopped. "Breck, and you can call me Ailsa. What do I call you?" "Merrow, Silas Merrow." "Mr. Merrow." She hung the coat on the hook behind her. "Sit down. The chair by the window doesn't wobble. The other one does." He sat on the one that didn't wobble, and he watched her with the careful attention of a man who has recently learned not to expect anything. And she went to make tea because it was November, and it was 4 in the afternoon, and the shop had been empty since morning. What she could not have known, threading a needle in a shop 4 lease payments behind, was that the coat she was about to mend for a stranger would cost her the cautious, diminished life she had been building since her mother died, and leave her standing inside something she hadn't known she was still allowed to want. But that came later. First, there was the tea and the grey harbour light, and a man too careful to accept help gracefully. She had inherited the needle and press from her mother 3 years back, a real inheritance, the kind that arrived with a lease in arrears, and a sewing machine that hummed too loud, and 2 boxes of old receipts she'd never had the heart to sort through. Her mother had run the shop for 30 years, and before that her grandmother had run a version of it in a smaller space 2 doors down. Ailsa had come back to Larkin's Reach after the funeral, meaning to sell it, and had found herself instead behind the counter on a Monday morning, a habit she couldn't explain and hadn't tried. The harbour town was small enough that a stranger sitting in the alterations shop window became a subject before the kettle boiled. She heard it back from her landlord the next day, that she'd taken in a vagrant, that soft-hearted Ailsa Breck would mend coats for free until the whole operation went under, that her mother would be turning in her grave to see the place run into sentiment. "Let them talk," she told Silas Merrow when he came back the second day and the third. Talking was the only entertainment in Larkin's Reach that didn't cost a cover charge. He came each afternoon at the dead hour when the school buses had gone and the supper orders hadn't started. He sat in the chair that didn't wobble. He drank the tea, and on the third day he asked her for a scrap of paper and a pencil, and he sat with them in his lap and began to draw with a quickness that changed his whole body. His shoulders dropped. The careful, braced quality of him went out like a held breath. He drew the shop, the window, the hanging coats, the dress form in the corner, the jars of buttons sorted by colour. He drew Ailsa at the machine with her hair falling forward over one eye. When she saw it, she went still. "You've got a steady face," he said, not looking up. Honest, like someone who's looked at difficult things and decided to keep looking. "That's not flattery. That's a description of a problem." He almost smiled. Maybe they're the same thing at a certain age. On the 4th day, he said, "I used to make things people kept." A pause. He turned the pencil over in his fingers. "There's a difference between a maker and a man who made. I'm still learning which one I am now." She filed that away without asking. She understood, somehow, that asking would cost him more than she wanted to take. Sterling Crow came on a Wednesday in a truck too clean for a gravel street, wearing a jacket that had no business north of Halifax in November. He set a folder on her counter and a card on top of it and slid both toward her the way a man slides a card when he's already decided the conversation is finished. Crow, Harrow Point Development. He had a smile that arrived ahead of the sentiment and stayed after it left. "The building's owner has had preliminary conversations with us," he said. "Your lease renewal is in 40 days. We've made it easy." He tapped the folder. "The number inside is real. Retail space is difficult right now. You know that. We both know what the books look like for a shop like this. You've seen my books. I've seen enough books like yours to not need to see yours specifically." Ailsa walked him out, not loudly, just steadily, until he was on the other side of the door and she had turned the lock. When she went back to the counter, Silas Merrow was watching her with an expression she couldn't fully read, something quiet and old and almost like a decision being made. "You turned him out," he said. "I did." He nodded. He reached into his breast pocket and drew out a stub of pencil and wrote something she couldn't read from across the room on the back of the paper she'd given him earlier. He folded it, didn't give it to her, put it back in his pocket. "Keep the shop open a little while longer," he said. "Can you do that?" "A little while I can manage. It's the long run that's the problem." He smiled then, the first full one she'd seen, and it took 10 years off his face and showed her what he must have looked like at 35. "Yes," he said, "that's generally where the trouble is." He left before it got dark. She didn't see which way he walked. When she went to clear the chair, she found a rusted iron key on the seat. Heavy, old, a braided leather cord looped through the bow, worn smooth with years of handling. A strip of paper was wound around the shaft and tied in place with the cord's fraying end. 4 words in a careful hand, for the stubborn one. She turned it over in the shop light. She had no idea what it opened. She put it in her apron pocket, told herself she'd give it back tomorrow, and went to close up. He did not come back the next day, nor the one after. On the third morning without Silas Merrow, a car came up the main road that had no business in Larkin's reach. Long, dark, unhurried, the kind of car that makes the gravel sound important under its tires. Ailsa watched it from behind the front glass with a length of hem tape going still in her hands. The woman who stepped out was silver-haired, linen suit, slim briefcase, moving with the particular unhurried calm of someone whose time other people have learned to wait on. The bell above the door gave its small sound. "Miss Ailsa Breck," the woman's voice was measured and cool. "My name is Mrs. Veach. I'm a solicitor. I represent the estate of Mr. Sus Merrow." She paused. "I understand you knew him as Silas." The name went through Ailsa like cold water. Knew, past tense. "Is he?" "He is entirely well," Mrs. Veach said, and something at the corner of her mouth might have been dry amusement. "He is at this moment on the ferry to Prince Edward Island, which is precisely the kind of behavior that makes my work difficult. He is not a man who explains himself. He acts and leaves the rest of us to draw up the documentation." Ailsa let out a breath so sharp it surprised her. "Then what documentation?" Mrs. Veach set the briefcase on the counter, unclasped it, and drew out a folder considerably heavier than sterling crows. "2 days ago, Mr. Merrow instructed me to execute a transfer of title. It is registered. It is done. There is nothing further to sign." She laid a hand on the folder. "As of this week, Miss Breck, you are the sole owner of the Merrow property north of town. The main house, the grounds, the workshop, and the 15 acres on which they stand. The last formal appraisal, conservative. The market has moved, placed the total at $1.1 million. The sewing machine hummed its too loud hum. Outside, the harbour wind pushed a gull sideways off a piling. "People don't just," Ailsa started. "Mr. Merrow does," said Mrs. Veach. "He has done it precisely once before in 40 years. I advised against it that time as well." She drew an envelope from the briefcase. Cream stock, heavy Ailsa, written across the front in the same careful hand she'd read on a strip of paper the night before. "He was very specific. You were to receive this after being told the figure, so that you'd read it knowing you weren't dreaming." She set it on the counter. Then she looked up and her cool eyes rested on Ailsa with something that was almost but not quite sympathy. "Before you open it, you should know you are not the only person with an interest in that property. Mr. Merrow has a grandson, Ewan. He manages what remains of the family holdings, and he is, by every measure I know, a capable and determined man. He did not know his grandfather intended this transfer. He knows now, I told him myself, this morning." She clicked the briefcase shut. "He is at this moment driving north." In her apron pocket, the rusted key was suddenly enormous. Ailsa broke the seal and read. The letter was short. No, dear, just her name in the careful hand. 9 sentences. A man who had carved her mother's face into wood panels for 38 years had spent fewer words on signing away $1 million than she used to describe the weekly alterations schedule. Ailsa, by the time you read this, Ailsa somewhere, you cannot return the key to me, which is the only way I have found to do a thing properly. You mended the coat of a man who told you he couldn't pay. You did it without being asked and without keeping the account. I have known a great many people who could afford to be generous and were not. You could not afford it and were anyway. I have spent 40 years understanding the difference between a thing you own and a thing you deserve. The workshop is a thing I owned. You are the first person in a long time I have watched deserve something. and I am too old to watch what I once watched happen again. Don't thank me. If you thank me, it means you think I did you a favor. I didn't. I did myself one. There's a locked room at the back of the workshop. The same key opens it. Whatever you find there, open the windows and let the light in. It belongs to you now. Let them find you standing, SM. She read it twice. The second time she stopped at I am too old to watch what I once watched happen again, and the sentence would not come loose. Ewan Merrow arrived at 3:30. She knew it was him before the truck had finished turning off the road. It was the second wrong vehicle in a week, too new for a gravel coast town, too quiet. He was younger than she'd braced for. 35, maybe 36. He wore coat the way people wear coats when they've never had to think about what coats cost. He let himself in without looking at the sign, and he stood in the middle of her shop and looked at the dress form and the button jars and the machine with an expression she couldn't mistake. "You'll be Miss Breck," he said. "I'll be the owner," she said. "Coffee?" "No." "It's made." She put a cup on the counter. "Sit down." He didn't sit. He came to the counter instead and set down a checkbook, actual paper, which struck her as a statement rather than an oversight. And he looked at her steadily with eyes that were his grandfather's, the same pale grey, the same quickness, the same capacity for looking at a person as though they were a problem to be correctly assessed. "I'll be direct, Miss Breck. My grandfather is 81 and he has been unwell. He is also theatrical and sentimental, and he has made, in his life, a number of decisions that prioritized feeling over consequence. A court considers that. It considers the 6 days between when you met him and when he transferred a significant property. It considers your financial situation." He clicked the pen. "Name a number. Something real. Something you can build something with." Ailsa looked at the checkbook. She thought of Mrs. Vache's voice. "Every weakness you show him becomes a sentence in a filing." "You love him," she said. Ewan went very still. "You drove up yourself," she said. "In your own truck. A man who only wants the property sends a lawyer. You came because you needed to see who I was." She slid the coffee cup toward him. "The cream's there." For a moment, something moved behind his expression, surprise, or the memory of it. Then it was gone. He did not sit, but he didn't leave either. "That property," he said, "is the last solvent thing the family has. There are people whose livelihoods run through Merrow Holdings. When my grandfather signed that deed, he didn't give you a gift. He handed a stranger the last functioning thing we own and got on a ferry. His jaw was iron. 400,000 today. You keep the shop, you clear what the bank has on it, and you never drive north." The number hummed in the cold shop air. It was real money. It was the kind of money that ended the particular slow anxiety of the last 3 years. It was the sensible number, the one a careful person took. "Let them find you standing." "No," she said. He blinked. "I understand 400,000 just fine," she said. "That part of what you said I understood completely." She took his untouched coffee and poured it into the sink because it felt like the right gesture. "But you called me the owner and then told me my life was luck and then offered me almost $500,000 to disappear. Somewhere in the middle of all that you told the truth, which is that you're frightened. Not of me. Of him. Of what he knew that you don't." Ewan's hand closed on the edge of the counter. "He left me a letter," she said. "It said there was someone he watched the system take everything from a long time ago. Someone who lost everything because of the Merrow family. He said that's why he gave it to me, so he wouldn't watch it happen twice." She held his gaze. "You don't know who that was. I can see it on your face." The silence in the small shop was complete enough that she could hear the harbour wind working at the sign above the door. He told her not to go to the workshop alone. He said the back room had been locked his entire life. His grandfather told him it was where he kept his failed work, and that whatever was inside, she shouldn't face it for the first time without someone who knew the family. He said 9 o'clock tomorrow. She went alone, of course. She went at 4:30, in the last of the November light, because she had spent 3 years being told by careful people what she couldn't afford to do, and the habit of doing it anyway was the one thing she'd inherited from her mother that actually fit. The Merrow property sat at the end of a lane, marked only by 2 stone posts gone soft with lichen, and a driveway that curved up through tall grass gone tawny with the season, and then the workshop. Low, cedar-shingled, older than the house behind it. The house itself pale clapboard, November grey, its shutters weathered to the colour of old pewter. The cedar that stood beside it was enormous, older than any grief Ailsa could name, its branches moving very slowly in the harbour wind. She stopped the truck without intending to. It was the most beautiful thing she had seen in a long time. And standing at the end of the drive with the engine cooling, she had never in her life been more certain that a beautiful thing was about to cost her everything. The front door had a bright new padlock fitted into old wood. Someone had been here recently, made this harder to enter, not easier. But the side door behind the cedar had an old iron lock, and the rusted key in her pocket found its place and turned without protest. Inside, sawdust and linseed oil and cold stone, tools hung in careful order on the walls, long workbenches, scarred with decades of use, clean, and at the far end of the workshop, a lamp burning, not empty. The woman who stood beside the lamp was old in the way of someone who has chosen to stay in a place through everything a place can do to a person. Small, square, deep-lined face, white hair pulled back hard, cardigan the color of old flannel. She did not startle at the door. She turned her head and considered Ailsa with two dark, bright eyes. "You came round the side," she said. "He said you would." "Who are you?" "Greta Holz. I've kept this property 38 years. Longer than you've been alive, nearly, and I've kept it on his word for the last 12 of them." She looked Ailsa up and down. "You've got chalk on your sleeve." Ailsa looked. She did. She'd been marking a hem before she left. "I own this property," she said, and heard how thin it sounded in the stone-floored room. "I know what you are," Greta said. "You're the coat." "The what?" "The coat. The mending. The woman who did it for nothing." Greta's mouth did something dry and knowing. "He telephoned me from the ferry terminal, if you can believe that. A man gives away $1 million and won't spend a quarter on a proper call," he said. "A woman named Ailsa is going to come up the side lane before dark, because I told the grandson not to bring her, and that's the surest way to make her come by herself. He knows people, I'll give him that." There was a sound outside. Far off, down the lane, the soft crunch of tires on gravel. Someone coming too fast. "There's a car on the drive," Ailsa said. "The grandson. He told you not to come alone, and you came alone, which means you're his straight through." Greta moved toward the far end of the workshop. "Come into the light before that one fills the room with money. There's a thing you need to see first." He was particular about that. First you, then the rest of them. The locked room was at the back. A solid wooden door, heavy iron lock, new padlock fitted beside it. The same key opened both. The room smelled of cedar shavings and beeswax and the faint green sweetness of things long dried. Greta's lamp swung its light across the far wall. Ailsa stopped breathing. Not paintings, carvings, panels of maple and cherry and golden ash, fitted frame to frame along the full length of the stone wall, floor to ceiling, dozens of them. Portraits, not scenes but a single face returned to again and again. A face in low relief, emerging from the wood as though the wood had always contained it and been waiting to be asked. A woman with a wide jaw and broad cheekbones and a mouth that was on the edge of something. Laughter, in most of the panels, or that particular stillness that comes just before laughter. A woman at a window. A woman at a work table with her hands flat on the surface. A woman in a doorway with her head thrown back in the middle of being delighted by something just out of frame. Caught forever in the act of it. Ailsa knew that jaw. She had inherited that jaw. She had spent 3 years glimpsing it in the dark window of the shop at closing time, thinking, "There's Mum, still watching the street." She could not finish it. "Lottie Breck," Greta said, though she'd been Lottie Merrow for 3 months the summer she was 22, before his family made certain she wasn't. The room tilted. Ailsa put one hand on the doorframe and held it. Greta told the story without mercy and without embellishment, the way you tell a thing that has needed telling for too long and cannot afford to be softened. Silas Merrow, 26, had spent a summer on the Nova Scotia coast and had met Lottie Breck, who was waiting tables at a cafe 3 kilometers south that wasn't even a foundation now. They'd married quietly before the summer ended. His family found out. His grandfather, who sat on the board of the bank that held Lottie's father's operating loan, made a single call. The loan came due in full. The mill closed in a season. The family scattered up the coast for work. Silas was made to understand that if he contested the annulment, the remaining Brecks would be ruined again, worse. So he signed what they put in front of him. And he came back to this workshop, and he carved her for 38 years, because the wall was the only place they'd let her stay. "She never married," Ailsa said. Her voice had gone very small. "She used to say the harbour was company enough." "Prideful as a cat, that one," Greta said, her voice staying flat even as her eyes went wet. "Same as him. 2 people too proud to be seen wanting a thing they weren't allowed to want. That's what finished them." Ailsa was crying now, quietly, without deciding to. She looked at her mother young on a panel of maple, laughing in a garden she had never seen. She thought of 38 years of the best craftsman's hours in the province spent on a woman who had believed, all her life, that she'd been the reckless one, the foolish one, the one who ruined things with her wanting. She had not been. The main workshop door banged open, and the cold November air came in around Ewan Merrow, who had run. She could see that he had run from the car. He stood in the doorway of his grandfather's workshop and looked at the wall of a woman he had never seen in his life. And Ailsa watched the cold, efficient certainty go out of his face like a lamp turned down. "Who is that?" he said. It wasn't a question, it came out cracked. Nobody answered. He walked into the room slowly. "The way you approach something you're afraid will change if you move too quickly." And he stopped in front of the panel of the woman in the doorway, the one laughing at something just out of frame. "There are 40 of them," he said. "I've been in this workshop 100 times. He told me the back room was where he kept the failures." His hand rose halfway toward the carved surface and stopped. Greta gave him the same story she'd given Ailsa, the same way, without softening, without apology. The great-grandfather, the bank, the loan, the memo. The girl who carried plates and loved the wrong man for her station, and was punished for it so quietly and so completely that she spent the rest of her life believing she'd deserved every loss. Ewan stood with his back to both of them for a long moment. When he turned, his face was wet and he didn't bother to conceal it, and Ailsa found that more unsettling than all his cold efficiency had been. "My grandmother sat at the end of the dining table for 30 years, he said, "and I thought she was simply a cold woman. I thought they were both cold, the whole house. Nobody touched anybody. I grew up thinking that was just what people were." He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "And it was this, all of it." They might have had more time, but tires turned into the lane without warning. No headlights. 2 cars moving quietly up the drive in the dark. Ewan went to the window. The color left his face entirely. "That's Sterling Crow," he said. "Greta, is there another way out of this room?" "The cellar door to the yard. I have the key." "Good." He turned to Ailsa and his voice had gone fast and quiet. "The box, take it now, don't set it down." Greta reached under the main workbench and lifted a flat cedar box into the lamplight. Old, brass clasps gone green, a new padlock bright against the wood, the twin of the lock on the back room door. "He had this fitted 6 weeks ago," she said, "same time as the others. And the key he left for the stubborn one." She held it out across both arms. Ailsa set the box on the work table. Her hands were steady. The shaking had stopped the moment there was something to do, the way it always stopped, the way it must have always stopped for the woman on the wall. Footsteps crossed the gravel unhurried, 2 of them, no lamps. The smoke of a cheap cigarette arriving ahead of its owner like a herald. Sterling Crow came in on the last of his cigarette and dropped it on the workshop floor and ground it out under a shoe that had cost more than Ailsa's sewing machine. His second man came in behind him, broad, silent, a flashlight held down and unlit. "Miss Breck," Crow said pleasantly, "I had a feeling you'd come up early." He had a document on the work table within 30 seconds. A title challenge, undue influence. An isolated elderly man, no family present, befriended over the course of a working week by a woman in acute financial distress. He had a check, $180,000, real money, he said. Not the paper number that evaporates the second a competent solicitor files to challenge it. Clear the lease. Go somewhere smaller. It doesn't have to be difficult. Ailsa looked at the document on her work table. She looked at the man who had ground his cigarette into the floor of a room where someone had spent 38 years making things worth keeping. She took the rusted key from her pocket and set it on top of Crow's document. "He called me stubborn," she said. "He wrote it down. You're the 3rd person this week to tell me what I can't afford to do." She looked up at him and she was not afraid, and she watched him register that she was not afraid, and watched it unsettle him more than any raised voice could have. "I've run out of patience for it." Ewan stepped between Crow and the work table. He didn't raise his voice. He got quieter, and that was worse. He laid out in the same methodical way he'd laid out a checkbook that afternoon, the full record of Sterling Crow's 8 months of work. The calls, the voicemails, the written correspondence detailing precisely what Harrow Point Development intended for anyone who wouldn't sell quietly. Greta as witness to tonight's arrival without headlamps, the document produced in a locked room in the dark. He gave Crow 30 seconds. Crow looked at Ewan for one long moment, the look of a man recalculating an opponent he has badly underestimated, and turned and went. His second man was already gone. The 2 cars tore back down the lane with none of the patience they'd come up on. The sound of them thinned along the coast road and was gone, swallowed by the dark and the wind in the cedar. Nobody spoke for a moment. The lamp swung slowly on its arm. Then Ailsa opened the cedar box. On top, a small carved panel no bigger than a paperback, the needle and press, her shop, its sign whole and bright, the window straight, the hanging coats inside just visible, and in the doorway a young woman with her hands on her hips and her head back in the middle of laughter. Her mother young, laughing at whoever held the chisel on the street outside. He had carved it from letters, Greta said softly. Lottie wrote him what the shop looked like, and he carved it blind because it was the one thing of hers he was allowed to keep imagining. Under it, documents blue-backed, soft with age, bound with old ribbon, a heritage and cultural preservation order, registered with the province 6 weeks ago, the full 15 acres, the workshop, the house, permanent, irrevocable, no development, no subdivision, no resort, protected in perpetuity by the order and the cultural foundation that held it. The land could not be built on. It had been legally protected before he ever walked into her shop. And below that, older documents, bank records, the operating loan, the board minutes. A memo dated 40 years prior in a hand Ewan recognized immediately. He went very still when he saw it, and she watched him read it once and then again, his great-grandfather's hand instructing the acceleration of the Breck loan, signed, witnessed, kept for 40 years in a cedar box because Silas Merrow had not been permitted to say sorry, but was too careful a man to destroy the receipt. So that someone, someday, would know that Lottie Breck had not been the foolish one, had not ruined her own family with her wanting, had only been the one they had not been afraid to punish. She died believing it was her fault, Ailsa said. It came out very quietly. She was still holding the carved panel of her mother laughing in a doorway she had never seen. Ewan set the memo down. He stood very still, and something in him settled. Not hardened, but settled, the way a thing settles when it finally understands the shape of itself. The workshop, he said after a long time. He said it differently from the way he'd said anything all day. The preservation order makes it eligible for cultural foundation designation. A working heritage site, a craft school. Residencies. He looked at the wall, a show. His whole life's work, shown properly. The carver and the woman he loved, the family that separated them. The wall he kept for 38 years because a wall was the only place they'd permit her to stay. He stopped. His voice had gone rough. That's the exhibition of the decade. That funds a school. That funds everything. I run a dry cleaning shop, Ailsa said. I know. I can thread a needle in the dark. I can look at something coming apart and figure out where to start. I don't know heritage designation or foundation applications or how to talk to a cultural board. She looked at him steadily. You do. You've been doing exactly that your whole life, keeping roofs on over things other people decided were past saving. He was quiet for a moment. I'd need someone who knows the workshop itself, he said. The tools, the teaching. I'd need someone who knows the institutions and the filing. That would be a partnership, he said carefully. Yes, she said, it would. Something shifted in his face that she hadn't seen there before. Not quite relief, not quite hope. More like a man who has been handed something and is only slowly understanding he's allowed to hold it. Not that night. They were both too cracked open, too full of what the evening had given them. He drove back to the coast road and she locked the workshop and took the cedar box and the small carved panel home in the truck. But in the weeks that followed, they found each other practical and steady and unexpectedly well matched, which is a harder thing to find than she had understood before she found it. The needle and press did not close. The lease was cleared in the spring from the first installment of the Cultural Foundation grant, not from selling a metre of Merrow land. Ailsa had the sign repainted. A woman came up from Halifax specifically for the job. She'd heard about the place. The Merrow Heritage Craft School opened the following September. 12 woodworkers in the first intake, a waiting list by the end of November. The carved room became the centre of the school. Lottie Breck. A portrait in wood, her name printed large on the doorway placard restored to the record that had removed it. People came from a considerable distance to stand in front of that wall and read the story told plainly on the card beside the door. The carver and the woman he loved, the bank and the loan, the family that bought compliance and called it propriety. The cedar box kept 40 years so that someone someday would know whose fault it wasn't. They wept in a workshop that had previously given no one reason to feel anything but awe at the craft. Sterling Crow moved his interests to another county. She wished him nothing particular. A man built around a thing he cannot get is already carrying his own punishment. Letters came from Prince Edward Island through the winter and the one after. No dear, just Ailsa in the careful hand. Complaints about the ferry schedule and the harbour wind, and a disagreement with a supplier that had apparently become something of a principle. He never asked to be thanked and she never tried. She wrote back on the backs of shop receipts. He said her handwriting looked like someone who'd made up her own mind. She thought that was the finest thing anyone had said about her in years. One letter, near the end of the second winter, had a single line below his account of a coastal storm. You mended the coat of a man who told you not to bother, and the coat turned out to be everything. Keep mending what people tell you is past saving. It's the only work that ever amounted to anything. SM. Ewan came to Larkin's Reach in October, 11 months after the night in the workshop. Not hurrying, which she had learned was new for him. He stood in the doorway of the needle and press on a Tuesday afternoon and said, without a checkbook or a flat voice or a single wall between them, I would like to take you to supper, Ailsa. Properly, if you'd like that. He looked, standing there in the last of the October light, entirely without armor. I've never been good at saying the thing that matters. I've watched people my whole life, and I never learned that part. You're saying it fine, she told him, and she hung up her apron and walked out from behind the counter to meet him. And they walked north toward the water in the late October light, the harbour going copper, the first stars arriving early over the headland, where no one would ever be allowed to pour concrete. They married in the workshop garden the following August. The carved wall was brought outside for the afternoon and placed at the edge of the cedar's shade where the light fell on it just right. Silas did not come. He sent a letter that arrived 3 days before, a single line, tell her I was always sorry I didn't carve her faster. She deserved more years on that wall. SM. Ailsa read it once and put it in her apron pocket and went to help with the tables. The needle and press stayed open. 3 mornings a week, Ailsa stood behind her own counter in the old shop that smelled of chalk and pressed wool and years of careful work. When someone came in at the slow hour between the school drop-off and the lunch rush, looking at the price board first and then away, she would take their coat from their arms before they'd finished, deciding whether they could afford the pride of asking. And she'd say there was no charge. Small already done. It would only unravel otherwise, and she'd stand there feeling wasteful. It was an elaborate lie. She had learned it from the best woman she'd ever known, and passed it, without knowing she was doing it, to the man she'd married. And she meant to keep telling it to strangers in Larkin's Reach for as long as she could thread a needle, because it turned out the old carver had been right about the one thing that mattered. It was always the coat. It had only ever been the coat.